Hi guys, and welcome back to Contract A. This is the week 3 videos for capacity to contract, and this is part 3. It should be our final part. So we've done our overview, we've done minors, and now we need to look at mental incapacity. Mental incapacity isn't as clear-cut as is anything in law, as you might think. Just because your senses were somewhat dulled will not excuse you from performing a contract that you've agreed to perform. The only thing that's really going to get you out of performing a contract will be if you were that badly affected that you were not even capable of understanding the broad nature of the transaction, okay? The broad nature of the transaction, and the other party has to know about it. Why is that? Because a plea of mental incapacity will mean that what you're asking the court to do is set aside the contract, to rescind the contract, as we talked about in part 2. So the contract is voidable, it is not void full stop. So that is mental incapacity as an overview in a nutshell. Let's have a little look here at understanding the nature of the transaction. In terms of understanding, as I said, you just have to understand the general, bits and pieces of what's going on. You don't have to understand the fine print. And the reason being, look, a lot of us, and myself included, enter into contracts where, we're not actually fully appreciative of the fine detail of what's going on. You've only got to think about when you've last entered some kind of click wrap agreement where, you've just said, yes, I agree to the page that's presented itself to you online with all of the fine print there. You just go, oh my gosh, I'm not reading that. You just click on agree and you get on with the job. As long as you're understanding the general nature of the transaction, the fact that you don't go ahead and read all of the fine detail will not allow you to step back later and say, hang on a minute, I was somehow incapacitated, okay? A lack of mental capacity means something quite serious. Now, it might arise from, just your mental condition or an illness, but it might also arise from drugs or alcohol. And as I said, the cutoff point is where you don't even understand the general purport of the instrument, and that is Gibbons and Wright. Okay, it may depend on the complexity of the document. So while you might be able to understand some simple stuff, simple contracts, and validly contract there, you may not, due to your condition, drugs, alcohol, understand a really super complex document because you might not even understand the general nature of it. So it might vary according to the circumstances and according to the complexity of the document. But generally, the touchstone is that if you understand the general purport of what you're doing, then you're going to be bound. Now, Gibbons and Wright is one case that the text goes into. It doesn't say a whole lot, or if anything, about a very famous case of alcohol abuse in which mental incapacity was argued. And that case is Blomley and Ryan. And I want to go through this case just because it outlines quite neatly the quite high bar that you need to get over in order to show that you didn't understand the nature of the transaction. So this, again, 1950s, so it's kind of getting towards this real frenzied activity in terms of capacity to consent that was going on in contract law for about that 100-year period, as I said. 1956, Tim Ryan was a 79-year-old farmer, lived outside of Gundawindi, up here in Queensland. He wanted to sell his farm. It was quite a large farm, and he originally wanted about £9 per acre. Now, that was actually a fairly reasonable request. It would have amounted to about £33,000 all up if he was going to sell. Now, he never actually actively went out and advertised or made it known that the farm was going to be up for sale. He actually had an inquiry from Mr. Blomley about his farm. Mr. Blomley was a fairly persistent fellow. When he heard Mr. Ryan's original response that he'd be looking for about £9 per acre, he was kind of off-put. It wasn't any kind of a real bargain. And he kept asking him, I guess maybe thinking that through attrition he might give in eventually. Ultimately, they ended up contracting. It says Blomley offered. Ultimately, it was Ryan, so you can cross that out of your notes. Ryan ended up saying that he wanted about £25,000, and bingo, Blomley said, yes, thank you, I'll buy. But what was the backstory really that came to explain the fact that there was a property, a substantial property near Gundawindi that was sold at such an undervalue? Because £9,000 in those days was an awful lot of money. Well, we know that poor old Tim had a reputation as a bit of a drinker, and he had drunk a lot in the days leading up to the contract. Normally, there was quite detailed evidence about how much he was drinking and how insensible he was when he was drinking. Although the court did say that perhaps he probably should have led a bit more evidence as to exactly the level of his capacity given his heavy drinking bouts. But on the day of the transaction that was leading up to the transaction, Blomley went to his farm again and said, what's your price today, Tim? And poor old Tim, at this point, he said his heart was softened because Blomley had offered him a bottle of rum. That and the fact that he was pretty, tired, his health was failing, wanted to get out of this particular property. He said, £25,000. Interestingly, Blomley had a friend called Mr. Stem who probably whipped out a contract and said, do you want to sign? Ryan, at that point, I think it's rather priceless, said, actually, no, why are we going to town? And I'll get my solicitor to draft up the contract. So must have had part of his wits about him. Blomley and Stem said, okay, no problem. We will actually come back here tomorrow and we will drive you into town to your solicitors. We'll all go there. We'll get the solicitor to draft up the contract, and Bob's your uncle will be happy, £25,000. Something must have happened the next day, and we think it's probably the fact that, poor old Tim Ryan had been on the sauce again, because they only rang the solicitor at 6:30 p.m. the next day, and they asked for an appointment at 7:30 p.m. Amazingly, the solicitor said, yes, no problem, come in and see me. Perhaps that's what you do as a solicitor in a remote and farming community when people need you later at night. And so they all go down, and the solicitor says, yes, I can smell rum on Tim Ryan's breath. Did he look capable of signing? Well, actually, the solicitor didn't really watch out for his client's best interests. He didn't really check that he understood the document properly. And so the court says, poor old Tim never really had a chance for any sober reflection. They say that he did sober up somewhat on the car trip from his property into the solicitors, such that he probably had a hazy understanding of being in the office there to sell his property and draft up a contract reflecting that, but there was no opportunity for sober reflection. As to his state that day, his friends say that he was sicker than they've ever seen him. He was lurching about on the staircase. He had to hold the rails for support, and he basically fell into the car. Poor thing, then managed to sober up a little bit, kind of understood what he was doing at the solicitors, and enough, perhaps surprisingly, to knock out the argument of lack of mental capacity. And I guess maybe at this point you're thinking, oh no, was that contract enforceable against poor old Tim Ryan? And the answer is no. I wanted to put you out of your misery. No, the contract was not actually enforceable. And this is where we have one of the very early cases of what we now call unconscionable conduct. And what they said was, and they allowed Tim Ryan's representatives to amend their pleadings quite late in the day, and there was a bit of argy-bargy about that. And what they argued was that, okay, even if he had a general understanding of the purport of the document that he was signing, what was the context in which this whole contract sprang into existence? Well, that whole context was pretty on the nose, wasn't it? And what they said was, STEM's object was to get a contract signed by the respondent before he emerged from his stupor. That he was emerging from it on the road from Boggabilla to Gundawindi, and the process had continued so far while in Rogers' office, Rogers was his solicitor, he attained to a hazy understanding of the fact that he was discussing a contract for the sale of his property need not be doubted. The learned judge so found. But it's another thing to say that the respondent had recovered his senses sufficiently to realise that the price of £25,000 and to judge for himself whether to sell at that price. Assuming, of course, that when he was not freshly sodden with rum, the impairing effects of old age and chronic alcoholism had not disabled him from protecting his own interests single-handed in a business transaction. It's a proper inference from the evidence that the respondent was not sufficiently in possession of what threads of intellect he retained to protect his interests during the negotiations or while the contract was being concluded. Blomley and Stem were well aware of his disability and weakness. Rogers, the solicitor, failed to protect him. The relative position of the contracting parties, the haste with which Blomley and Stem proceeded to bind the respondent by a contract, the enormous discrepancy between the price and the market value, and the other inequalities in the contract raise a strong presumption that they procured the bargain by behaviour which is within the category of constructive fraud. The bargain's unfair to the point of being a hard bargain. The parties were not on equal terms. Stem and Blomley took extremely unfair advantage of the condition and circumstances of the respondent. And on that basis, they said the contract was voidable for that unconscionable conduct. So even though he could understand the general purport of the document, what happened was there was such a disparity in the bargaining power of the parties and such inequality in terms of the context that he wasn't able to look after his own interests. Okay, and in that circumstance, equity's jurisdiction is enlivened and the contract will become voidable in equity. Okay, so knocked out in terms of arguing against his mental capacity, but was successful in unconscionable conduct. So this is a good case to look at for a number of different reasons. And we build on this understanding in Contract B, so it's good to get a little understanding of it here. But it knocks out the whole idea that, trying to argue a lack of mental incapacity is easily established, because it's absolutely not easily established. But what it also shows is the court's concern to step in and preserve the interests of a party that's being taken advantage of, okay? You might be able to understand generally what you're doing, but you can't look after your own interests. And if that's the case, then equity can do something about it. So that is mental incapacity and understanding the nature of the transaction. Okay, what's the other prong in the argument that you need to prove when you are trying to establish that you were mentally incapable of understanding what it was that you were doing? You have to show that the other party was aware that you were mentally incapable. Okay, if the other party is not aware of your problem, then you can't set aside or ask the court to set aside the contract for lack of mental capacity. Here we have the case of Hart and O'Connor, and this case, actually, the text does go into this case. We have an 83-year-old of unsound mind, and Mr. O'Connor sold some land to Mr. Hart. He looked the part, he looked sane, he spoke reasonably, and so Mr. Hart didn't actually know that he was of unsound mind. What happened next? Well, the O'Connors, two brothers of the ailing 83-year-old Mr. O'Connor, stepped in to try and have the contract set aside as representatives of Mr. O'Connor. On appeal, it was held that the contract was valid. Why is that? Because Mr. Hart never actually knew about the lack of mental capacity. Okay, so they're the two requirements for setting aside a contract for mental incapacity. Oh, the last thing that we should cover off is who can set aside a contract for lack of mental capacity. It will be the person themselves if they regain capacity, or their representatives. Okay, here we have the case of Gibbons and Wright. No real magic to this. We have three sisters who owned some land as joint tenants. That means that as each sister passed away, her share in the land would go to the remaining sisters. Okay, what they did was they signed a deed changing their ownership, I'm not even sure why you do this, to tenants in common. And that means that as each sister passed away, her share would go to only her own heirs rather than to her sisters. On the death of two of the sisters, obviously then their shares went to their respective heirs, and the last remaining sister was a bit annoyed about all of this, and so she tried to have the deed changing the ownership from joint tenants to tenants in common set aside. You can kind of see why she failed here, and it was held that only those affected, once they regained mental capacity, could ask the court to have the deed or contract set aside, or their representatives. In this case, certainly the representatives of the two sisters that passed away did not seek to have the deed set aside, and so the last remaining sister was unsuccessful in her attempt to have it set aside. It kind of lines up a little bit with something that we're going to discuss in a few weeks' time. Just bookmark that, the word of privity, and that explores who is involved in an agreement and who can sue on it and who can't sue on it. So yeah, we have the action for trying to set something aside for a lack of mental capacity failing because it wasn't the person who had been personally affected by the mental incapacity or their representatives that was trying to have the thing set aside. So that is who can set aside the contract for a lack of mental capacity. And they are the contractual prerequisites to contract. One last thing that I did want to mention this week, and that is when you are trying to do your IRAC. It's a little bit different to last week because, and I'm seeing some very good IRACs on the intention to create legal relations, homogenous problem that you were set under the week 1 tab. So, sorry, the week 2 tab. So that's good. Keep them coming in. But that IRAC, the one about the rock and roll cafeteria and the guy that fixed the jukeboxes and the girl that I think it was Katrina, that had a 50s fashion boutique, and Emma that was the business partner. We had to work out whether there was intention to create legal relations. Generally speaking, in the tube, all we basically did was focused on homogenous, and we focused on, in terms of the IRAC, looking at the particular circumstances of that case and the facts that would suggest to us that yes, this was in fact a commercial context in which the parties were bargaining, and the actual conduct of the parties themselves, the language, the fact that they got a contract drafted up, that all pointed to the fact that they intended to create legal relations. In those kinds of cases, because intention to create legal relations is such a fact-specific forensic process that the court has to go through, you're not so reliant on precedent in order to try and prove the strength of your case. Certainly it's a bit like salt and pepper. You can pop a few cases in there to spice up your answer, and if you have some precedent that was similar to something like what we looked at, it certainly wouldn't hurt to throw in a couple of cases where friends had nevertheless been held to contract. Some of those gaming cases, for example, where people pooled money to go into a lotto together, where they were held to have had intention to create legal relations. Those kinds of cases may help. But intention to create legal relations really is quite fact specific, and it's good because it eases us into the whole problem answering process kind of gently, and we kind of got to look mostly at the facts last time. This week we're moving more into the traditional type of problem answering, and so you will need to know much more about the cases, more about the facts of those cases, in order to try and line up and see which way you think a court might come down when they are looking at this issue of Glenys, the seamstress, and Nem, the miner that wants her formal dress, and Jenny, the person who has this depressive illness that wants this fancy dress. So when you're looking at that problem, have a little look at the cases of Nash and Inman and Hart and O'Connor, and see if you can weave your IRAC together using argument from the facts in Nash and Inman and Hart and O'Connor to try and strengthen your case. Have a look at my IRAC tips sheet. If you've got time, there's also the IRAC autopsy video that's up on the skills tab on Moodle. And have a go. Write out your answer for me. If you don't like the IRAC format, that's fine, absolutely. Just write out your answer in, the best, most compelling way that you know how. There are other alternatives to IRAC, and again, that's in the materials that are on the skills tab on Moodle. And have a bash, see what you think. If you like, send it in to me, and I'll be more than happy to provide you with some feedback if my computer's all good still, which it hasn't been this week. But thank you for looking at the videos, and as I always say, if you have any questions, please post something up on Moodle, send me an email, post up on Facey. But do keep the questions and the discussion happening. Law is a talking discipline, so the more we do of that, the better you'll all be. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in a Zoom sometime soon, and thanks for watching. Bye, guys.